Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. My name is Joanna Sirk-Smith, and I'm the Associate Director for State Outreach at Carolina Public Humanities. And today we're thrilled to be holding this lecture in collaboration with our partners at Sandhills Community College. During this strange time of all virtual programming, it has been so encouraging to work with partners like Sandhills, who we know share our commitment to continuing to provide opportunities for public engagement with the humanities, as well as our belief that the humanities have an absolutely critical role to play during these uncertain times. Now, I want to extend a huge thank you to Flyleaf Books, which has been so generous in letting us film this event along with many others in their space. And they are still open for business, so if you're here in Chapel Hill, I highly recommend that you come down and browse. They certainly have a number of books related to the topic of dictators. And I also want to say a huge thank you to Paul Benici, who's running our tech right now, to Max Orr and to Lloyd Kramer from Carolina Public Humanities, as well as to Heather Lyons and Ron Lane at Sandhills for all the work they've put into pulling this event together. And if you enjoy what you see here today, I encourage you to tune into some of our upcoming programs. Tomorrow afternoon at 3:30, Brett Whalen will be presenting a talk on the Black Death. And on Friday at noon, Max Orr will be hosting another lunch with friends and strangers, this time in conversation with historian Don Raleigh about Leonid Brezhnev. So you can find registration info for those events and for many more at humanities.unc.edu. And I also encourage you to check out Sandhills' lineup of fantastic events, both virtual and in person at the Bradshaw Performing Arts Center, by visiting sandhillsbpac.com/events. And we'll share links to both of those sites in the chat. This afternoon, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Richard Talbert. Dr. Talbert received his PhD from Cambridge University, and he is the William Rand Keenan Jr. Professor of History at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Talbert's research focuses primarily on Greek and Roman spatial perceptions and on mapping the classical world. Today, he'll be presenting to us on the topic of Roman use and abuse, dictators of the Republic from Cincinnatus to Caesar. And his talk will help us to reflect on what models the Roman Republic gives us for thinking about what forms representative leadership might take and how dictatorship has looked to past civilizations. Just as a reminder, if questions come to mind for you throughout Dr. Talbert's presentation, you can enter them into the chat. They won't interrupt his presentation, but we'll simply return to them at the end of the talk during our Q&A section. And you are all muted, your videos are off, and we encourage you to set your Zoom to speaker presentation so you can see the slides as large as possible. Now I hope you'll all join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Talbert. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Okay, so this is me. Yes, hello everybody. Thank you for being here. You can see I've got a mask, which I'm being good, so I'm now going to take that off. If that's all right, I can do that. I hope. So, can I take this away as well? Yeah, I may as well. I can get it. Or do you want to? Yeah. Thanks so much. Yes. How's that? Is that better? Yeah. Good, great, and thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Paul. Everybody's here who is everybody is two people. Whoops, and they're feet away, who are all making this happen, and I'm very grateful to you for that. There's a danger, a real danger here. You should know that I'm going to be a disappointing speaker. Because, as we all know, dictators and dictatorship have always been considered a bad thing. So, no doubt, you are eagerly hoping that I am going to tell horror stories about Roman abuse of power and all that kind of stuff. And it's going to be a very thrilling afternoon as a result. But I'm going to be a bit disappointing in the sense that my message is the opposite, the unexpected opposite. Namely, that among Romans, where the idea of dictatorship seems to have originated, it remained for several centuries a good thing that was not abused. Now that may surprise you because that's the counterintuitive claim and you're going to want convincing about this. So let me explain. And the best way I think I can do that, first, is by setting the whole idea of Roman dictatorship in context. To gain a reliable grasp of the Roman community and how it was run during its early centuries is a challenge, to say the least. Archaeology can shed some light on certain aspects, but for matters like who was in charge and on what terms, we're dependent on the little that survives from Romans' own accounts of their past. This is a type of record, historical writing, that they didn't even begin to create until about 200 BC, or if you like, BCE. Inevitably, therefore, their grasp of what had happened several centuries earlier, at a time when almost nothing was written down, was shaky. So they filled the huge gaps by repeating, for example, family legends, or by speculating about the circumstances in which established institutions of their own day had evolved. So you can understand that we, over 2 millennia later, with so much lost, can't hope to reconstruct Rome's distant past with confidence. But when that is said, there are a few key features for present purposes that I think we can consider credible. So let me touch on these. First, the fact that we only know from archaeology that during the late 600s, what had been a cluster of villages in the region called Latium, and you can see that on the map, which maybe is on the screen. It's near the bottom of the map, the region of Latium. That's on the west side of Italy. These villages integrated themselves into a single urban community, which became the city of Rome. And they constructed a purposely created center for public business, the Forum. And you can see that if we go on to the next picture on the screen. Now, if you say, well, who organized this remarkable feat and how? We don't know. And there wasn't even a later Roman tradition about it. We know nothing except what archaeologists can tell us. Secondly, there was a tradition which represented Rome's earliest form of rule as a kingship. More specifically, a succession of 7 kings. Some of them, at least, from Etruria. And if we go back to the regional map, you could see Etruria. It's the region right on the west side of Italy, just north of Latium, across the river Tiber. Etruria was the region where the people were the most developed at that time of all the many peoples up and down the Italian peninsula. The tradition said that Rome had a succession of 7 kings. As I say, some of them from Etruria, and that's credible. After all, the Etruscans were more advanced. Rome was no more than a place of local importance, and it's not a surprise that they came to be dominated, the Romans came to be dominated and ruled by some Etruscans. And the notion that it was a king is supported by the term rex, occurring in the Latin that's inscribed on 1 or 2 monuments from early times. These are monuments that have survived, and this title, rex, we can read on some of them in a very early form of Latin. Romans, you realize, didn't speak Roman. They spoke the regional language. Their region was Latium, and that's why they spoke Latin. And you should have a checklist of names. I don't know whether everybody got that, or they did, right? Here it is on the screen now, but you might also have it separately. So if you want to find out how to spell things and so on, or remember some of these terms, you can. But that's as you wish. What the tradition said is that the king ruled as an autocrat for life, supposedly after he had been elected by an assembly of Rome's citizens. So this wasn't actually a hereditary monarchy, but once the king was elected, he was king, autocrat for life. And he had a senate, an advisory council of Rome's leading figures to give him advice. He didn't have to take the advice, but it was there as an advisory body. And obviously it would be sensible of him to take it seriously, but nonetheless he was in the end an autocrat. The third thing to give context is to say that there is a credible tradition that this monarchy was brought to an end around 500 when the reigning king, the seventh king, the tradition says, was driven out, and then a very anti-monarchical form of rule was instituted instead. The citizens did this, and they called their new setup the res publica. In other words, an entity in the public interest. The idea being this is anti-monarch. We're not subjects of a king anymore. The state belongs to us, its citizens. Now, oddly enough, the way in which this change was instituted was both radical and conservative in nature. On the one hand, the new setup was designed, above all, to prevent any individual in future from ever becoming anything like a king. This is a strongly anti-monarchical setup. So Rome's rulers now were two joint heads of state called consuls, each of whom had to be elected by a citizen assembly to hold office for a single year only, after which they were debarred from competing to be consul again for at least 10 years. During their year of office, they couldn't be removed, so Rome didn't have our equivalent of impeachment. But after their year of office was over and they became private citizens again, they could then be prosecuted for alleged wrongdoing during their year. However, on the other hand, the Senate remained unchanged, though now its function was to advise the consuls rather than the king. But still, the Senate could only meet when summoned, now by one or both consuls whenever they had some issue on which they wanted advice. Also, the office of consul came with imperium. That is, the unlimited authority that the king had once wielded. And now it was the consuls who could wield it. And this authority included, very importantly, the power as judge to order a death sentence and the power to draft troops and to command them. Before, only the king had imperium, and even now, only the two consuls. So you may be thinking, oh, well, in that case, each consul is essentially a king for a year. Yeah, That's correct. Now, there are two consuls at once. You've got to remember that. But yeah, if you want to say, well, this isn't much of a revolution if you've now got really two mini kings in charge, when before you had one and now you've got two, and that isn't much different, is it? Yeah, if you want to think of it that way, you're correct. And it's also true that each consul could act independently. The two were not obliged to work as a pair, although, as you can imagine, it would certainly smooth things if they did try to coordinate. Of course, if they tried to coordinate, such attempts might fail, they might not agree. And the new arrangements did allow for each consul to be able to block his colleague from proceeding with some course of action or proposal by exercising a right of veto. Each consul could block his colleague. He could stop action or even a proposal by a colleague. Now, you're going to say, well, and you know this also from republics, that if a veto is imposed, things might not get done. But that was a price which Romans were willing to pay in order to guard against their constant fear that one man might seize all authority and exercise it indefinitely. And so, in other words, bring about a return to the hated monarchy, when everybody was merely a subject of the king. In the Republic, on the other hand, by contrast, as I've said, the whole idea was that the state should belong to its citizens. And the two heads of state weren't expected to be very active unless there was some pressing need. Romans were highly conservative people. They were hostile to any interference by the state in their activities and their private lives. And they were most reluctant to increase the number of office holders. They wanted to keep the number of office holders to an absolute bare minimum, in particular the number who had imperium. Now, normally there wouldn't be a need for more than just the two consuls with their imperium, because, as I've said, remember, early Rome was for a long, long time not a great city, nor even one of more than regional importance. So you're going to ask, well, in all this then, where does the dictatorship come in? Where does the idea of the Roman dictatorship come in? Well, the first thing to say is, so far as we can tell, this whole notion of a dictatorship was a new idea. This was a genuinely novel idea, and I think actually rather a clever one. It's a trusting one, but it's also quite shrewd. If you say, well, who thought of it? Who were the Romans who set up the res publica after the last king had been booted out? We don't know. We don't actually have any names. We also don't know whether they borrowed the idea of a dictatorship or adapted it from some other community in Italy. Certainly we can say that there was never a Greek state. No Greeks ever had anything like a dictator enshrined in their constitution. The way Romans thought of it was that if you only have two holders of imperium at any one time, Rome could unexpectedly find itself in a crisis when help from a third Roman who also had imperium could be very useful. It could be urgently required and could be very useful. And let me emphasize, the dictator, like a consul, had imperium. And this situation where the two consuls suddenly and desperately need help is what happens in the classic case of Cincinnatus that you may have heard of. This is the case of Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, who we're told was a very respected figure who had been one of the consuls in 460. Then, says the tradition, which no doubt has been very much embroidered, but let's stick with the basic story as we have it. A couple of years later, in the 450s, one consul and his army found themselves suddenly surrounded by a group of hostile mounted people in Latium. They're people called the Aequi, and you can see them there just to the north of Latium, there, again, quite near the bottom of the map. One poor consul and his army are surrounded by the Aequi. They're in a real jam. Meantime, unfortunately, just at the same time, the other consul and his army were preoccupied with fighting another set of hostile people on the map a little bit further north, the Sabines in that region, that area called Sabinum, again north of Rome, but in Latium. So both consuls are tied up by Rome's enemies. So this second consul, the guy who is trying to deal with the Sabines, with the Senate's approval, promptly nominates Cincinnatus as dictator, with instructions to raise a third force at once, and with it to break the Aequi's stranglehold on the army that was surrounded. And you may have heard this story already. There is Cincinnatus, the respectable figure, a landowner, of course. He's in the midst of ploughing. He's busy ploughing. But when the envoys come and ask him to leave his plough and come to Rome immediately, he does. He recruits a force of citizens, and with it he disperses the Aequi and relieves the trapped Roman army. He's successful. And within 15 days, with mission accomplished, he is back in Rome. He's been dictator for 15 days. And then, straight away, the job done, the job he's been commissioned to do, the job is done successfully. He resigns his office and goes home back to his plough. And we can get a little handkerchief, the Kleenex out here, perhaps, and just dab away our tears of admiration. And, of course, we don't have any video clips of that, unfortunately, from antiquity, but this has been the inspiration for all kinds of painters later, and there are plenty of them. You can Google these, but this is a Spanish one by Juan Antonio Ribera y Fernandez that's in the Prado in Madrid, and this was painted early in the 19th century, about 1806. And you can see here the envoys are arriving. He's been ploughing. He doesn't actually look very sweaty, but I suppose this has been souped up to look good, and he's going to go off to Rome and meet the call to be dictator. And I won't need to remind you, as an American audience, that George Washington's contemporaries, with their classical education, came to regard him as a latter-day Cincinnatus. A man who unhesitatingly accepted the call to become the commander of the Continental Army in June 1775, even refusing any salary. And it was again this Roman example that led Major General Henry Knox to name the Hereditary Association of Continental Army and Navy Officers that he founded in 1783 as the Society of the Cincinnati, with its motto, Omnia reliquit servare rem publicam. He left everything in order to safeguard the Republic. He abandoned his ploughing or whatever in order to safeguard the Republic. Omnia reliquit servare rem publicam. And you'll also know, I'm sure, that in 1790 it was in honor of the society that its then president, Arthur St. Clair, governor of the Northwest Territory, renamed the settlement of Losantiville in Ohio, established in 1788. He renamed it as Cincinnati, which it still is today. Well, the way in which the terms dictator or dictatorship are typically bandied about today signifies, as you know, sweeping, unlimited authority, often supposedly exercised in a nation's interest and for the people, but still power that is all too liable to be abused, to be misused. But it's important to recognize, and I want to stress this, that this was not the Roman conception. Now, it's true, the Roman office of dictator does depart from some Roman Republican norms. There is no election for this office. Instead, it's enough for one consul on his own initiative to nominate a dictator. And that citizen can then assume the authority of the office, which, as I've said, has imperium, straight away, at once. And he can nominate his own deputy, a deputy who has the title Magister Equitum, Master of Cavalry. And the deputy also has imperium. Now, as is underlined by the meaning of the word dictator in Latin, the assumption is that when a dictator gives orders to get a job done, he will be obeyed instantly and without question. Yes. But, now here we start on some buts, and this one is a big but. The nomination to the Roman office of dictator always comes with instructions to tackle a specific job. A dictator has no mandate to act beyond the scope of the job assigned to him. As soon as that job has been successfully completed, moreover, he must resign his office at once, in the way Cincinnatus did. If by chance the job is still not completed at the end of 6 months, which in practice proved a great rarity, that would seldom be the case, then after 6 months the dictator must resign anyway. So, altogether, as you realize, the Republic's aim is on the one hand the practical one of gaining the immediate help of a third holder of imperium when a critical situation arises that neither consul can handle, but still, on the other hand, there is great concern to safeguard against this third holder exploiting his sudden empowerment to try and expand his authority and for the long term in such a way that he brings about, in effect, a return to monarchy. The Romans they want to prevent a dictator having the idea that he can upgrade himself to a fixture, like a king almost, indefinitely. The title Magister Equitum for the dictator's deputy reinforces the impression that the type of crisis most likely to call for a dictator was going to be one involving military action, as in the instance when Cincinnatus was called upon. But again, and we have another but, or this time an if we can trust what the Roman record tells us about all the instances when a dictator was nominated, and that's about 90 instances, it would seem that this impression of military action being needed most is correct. And usually it's against external enemies like the Aequi or the Sabines. But it can occur in Rome itself if, for example, there was rioting which the consuls could not be present themselves to suppress. They might have to be away. And the city of Rome, we should bear in mind, Republican Rome had no police force. So if there was rioting that got out of hand, an office holder with imperium who could draft troops and use them might be useful. Again, when both consuls had to be away, a dictator might be nominated to preside over annual elections in Rome that it was a consul's duty to hold, and elections that couldn't be delayed. And it's the same with certain games, certain festival games in honor of the gods that a consul had to celebrate. If neither consul could be there, then nominate a dictator to fulfill that role. Equally, there's an annual ceremony, which we used to think rather quaint, but I suppose this year we don't. It's a ceremony at which a consul hammers a nail into the wall of the temple of Rome's chief patron god, Jupiter, Jupiter best and greatest, as a precaution to keep the city free from outbreaks of plague. I think that's a ceremony we'd want to perform very carefully this year in our society. And Romans, we should realize, took their religious rights very seriously. They felt that if they didn't, then they might lose the gods' support. But there was this annual ceremony where a consul, it had to be a consul or somebody with equivalent authority, hammers the nail into the wall of the temple. And you can see that temple, if we go back, yeah, it's more or less in the middle actually of what you're now seeing on the screen. It's up on the Capitol. It's what's number 3 there, pretty much in the middle of that page. Now, you may say, well, to hold an election or celebrate a festival or hammer in the nail, you're not going to have to use imperium. No, that's true, you're not. But still, what you had to have was an office holder whose authority matched that of a consul. But even so, the man nominated to be dictator for such mainly formal functions didn't have to be specially distinguished, and that's why many of the 40 or so dictators that we hear of in the period when the office was used most seem to be actually just pretty unremarkable members of the Senate. The dictatorship was used most, I should say, in the 4th century BC. In the 300s BC or BCE. After about 300, far fewer dictators were nominated, because at that point it was finally acknowledged that there simply had to be more office holders with imperium on a regular basis. The gradual and widely resisted expansion of Rome's control into Italy called for more armies to be deployed up and down the Italian peninsula every year. The Roman solution was not to create more offices with imperium. They didn't want to do that. But instead, what they did was to ask consuls whether after their 1 year in office they would be willing to retain their imperium for the following year and to be assigned a command to a particular army, to be put in charge of a particular army. And if the consul said yes, then when he was ex-consul in this role, commanding an army to which he was assigned, he was called a proconsul, and in effect he performed what had been a dictator's role. But the engagement of such help was now regularized, and notice, it was determined by the Senate now. Invitations to serve as proconsul came only from the Senate, whereas a dictator could be nominated by a single consul. And this is a shift, an important shift, and it's a sign that the Senate, despite being in principle only an advisory council, was now increasingly taking the initiative in directing Rome's affairs as they became more complex. When Quintus Fabius Maximus was made dictator in 217, after the Carthaginian Hannibal had crushingly defeated a Roman army at Lake Trasimene in Etruria. That's north of Rome. I can't really point that out very easily to you, but maybe you can see that. Go north of Rome, the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217, a terrible Roman defeat. After that, this man, Quintus Fabius Maximus, was made dictator, and that's about the first time in about 80 years that a dictator was appointed to take a military initiative. And you may know that Fabius's strategy was not to risk another pitched battle with Hannibal and the Carthaginians, but instead to wear them down with a scorched earth policy. And you may also know that other Romans found this policy very, very frustrating, made Fabius most unpopular, and earned him the famous insulting nickname cunctator, delayer, postponer. Hey, guy, you've got the army, you've got the authority. What do? You don't have a showdown with the Carthaginians. You just sort of follow him round and nibble at his heels. Why don't you go for the jugular? Why don't we have a showdown? And that was shown to be not quite such a good idea, because there was another catastrophic Roman defeat at Cannae the following year in 216. And for that, you've got to go down from Rome and towards the southeast. You'll see perhaps the Battle of Cannae. That's an even worse Roman defeat in 216. But you may have heard of the Fabian Society that was founded in Britain in 1884 to advance democratic socialism gradually, with the emphasis on gradually. And this society, the Fabian Society, was named, of course, after the Roman dictator Fabius Maximus. And this is a society whose principles have continued to exert a strong influence on many members of the Labour Party in Britain. After the long war with Hannibal ended in Carthage's defeat in 201, the dictatorship became a resource that just fell into disuse. By now, Rome was a Mediterranean power with far-ranging interests and commitments. There were now sufficient regular holders of imperium, and even if another one were to be urgently needed, that 6-month limit on a dictator's tenure would seldom have allowed him sufficient time to launch a campaign overseas and complete it successfully within the 6-month period. And also, as I've remarked, a victorious dictator who let the potential power of his office go to his head and tempt him to take over Rome for himself had always been a source of fear among senators. By this date, by now we're getting into the 100s, this fear was more acute than ever. Proconsuls now were being kept in their commands for 2 years or even 3 to finish off mighty kings in Greece or Asia Minor. And the richness of the loot that they and their men could grab was beyond Romans' wildest dreams. In these circumstances, as you can imagine, there was no wish to risk giving such a proconsul further delusions of grandeur by allowing him the title dictator. No. Proconsul is quite enough. Towards the end of the 100s, the 2nd century, for occasions when a sudden wave of unrest at Rome itself had to be dealt with, the Senate devised a new and ugly expedient, and it was one that was much criticized, I may add, and this was to pass a special ultimate resolution, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the Senate's ultimate decree. This is a new idea around about 120. This empowered the consul named in the resolution to take whatever steps were needed to restore order, guaranteeing him protection from any subsequent prosecution. Those steps could include deploying troops in the Forum and its surrounding areas, where normally they were forbidden. And it also allowed him to kill Roman citizens who broke the peace without the trial or due process that was a Roman citizen's right. Now, in earlier times, as you realize, taking these sorts of emergency actions is something that a dictator might have been nominated for. But, as I've said, by now the dictatorship was no longer a favoured option, although Romans certainly didn't forget that for centuries in the past this had been an office that was put to use frequently. So, it would be perfectly natural for my talk to end here. You'll be delighted I'm going to finish early, and that's fine, because, yeah, there now are not any more dictators. So is there anything more to say? Well, in a way, no. But on the other hand, what's surprising is that after an interval, two more do emerge. There are a couple more, and they're both important to think about, although I should tell you straight up now, both are wolves in sheep's clothing. They take the title dictator, and they adopt the traditional idea of the office as their starting point, but they then expand it in novel and disturbing ways. The man behind this initiative originally, the first one at the end of the 80s, was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who was a ruthless and successful general who had suffered personally from outrageous political maneuvers by rival senators. Sulla was keenly aware, as everybody else at the time was too, that for the past 50 years or so, the principles by which the Republic ran its affairs were in fact being repeatedly ignored or overridden. Political anarchy, accompanied by violence, had resulted. Sulla was determined to bring back stability and to revive and strengthen the traditional principles of the Republic that he genuinely believed in. Now, it's true, this was a very conservative vision, but at least it was a vision at a time when Rome badly needed some vision. And Sulla had the courage to try and implement his vision. He realized that he would have to act in an exceptional way to achieve it, but still he wanted to proceed in as republican and legitimate a style as he could. Well, as you know, the only office that the Republic had ever instituted for meeting an exceptional need was the long disused dictatorship. So I think in the circumstances it's understandable that this office, or at least this title, became Sulla's choice. But the uses to which the dictatorship had been put to in the past, when it functioned long before, didn't match what Sulla now had in mind. For one thing, the 6-month time limit was too restrictive for him. So he kept the title, but otherwise he put the whole office on a new and larger footing, and a disturbing one. The purpose for which he would hold the office was still defined. Yes, it's true, it was defined, but in a much more open way than ever before. And this was phrased as Sulla was to put the state in order and to draft laws. Well, that is a mission, that's a definition, but you can see it's extremely broad. And in addition, as I say, there was now no time limit. He could remain dictator indefinitely. What's more, wait for this, try to digest this, any action he took, any law he put forward was to be automatically valid. He was not obliged to consult the Senate about anything, or to make any proposal that was subject to approval by the vote of a citizen assembly. And it gets worse. He was also free to execute any citizen without trial, and he even published a hit list, what was called a proscription list. This is new. This is completely new. A proscription list. This is a list of citizens that he encouraged anybody to kill, and there would be no penalty. Indeed, there would be a reward. right? This is a list up on the wall. If you recognize any of those names, and you can find, well, they were men, I think, yeah, all men. If you can find one of those men, go kill him, bring in his head, and you will be rewarded. Ugh, yeah, not happy, not happy. In short, Sulla made himself what political theorists have often termed a sovereign dictator, rather than a commissary dictator. This is theory language, but you get the distinction. The old idea of the Roman dictatorship was you're given a well-defined, specific job to do, and that only, whereas a sovereign dictator has sweeping powers. And as you realize, sovereign dictatorship was exactly what the founders of the Roman Republic had been most concerned that their dictatorship should not turn into. And so Sulla overturns that and twists or trashes the traditional idea of the dictatorship into a sovereign office. Now, as it happened, the set of rules and principles that Sulla imposed as sovereign dictator fairly soon failed for reasons we needn't go into now. But we should take note of one way in which Sulla did actually, in the end, still reflect the thinking behind Rome's regular form of dictatorship. And this is that he did resign the office once he had made the reforms he wanted. In fact, he resigned after about a year, rather than the traditional 6 months. In other words, Sulla regarded even his much more powerful type of dictatorship as only a short-term means to deal with a crisis. He did not make it the way for himself to rule Rome effectively as king for the long term, indefinitely. To do that was emphatically not Sulla's aim. And that he didn't resign out of cowardice or anything. He wanted to restore the Republic. He wanted to put the Republic back on track so it could function again, he hoped, in the stable and generally law-abiding fashion that it had done prior to the previous half-century. Now, as I say, Sulla's solution for arranging a return to this stability and making it stick proved far from adequate. But we do need to recognize his strong commitment to maintaining the Republic. Just over 30 years later, after Sulla died in 78, another politically ambitious senator, Julius Caesar, again strove to assert his control over the Republic. But to achieve this mastery, he had to challenge and fight the establishment, who were a group headed by his fellow senator Pompey. You may know this, early in 49, Caesar made the opening move in what became a bitter civil war that raged all over the Mediterranean world. It did result in him winning, but it took him until early in 45 to achieve that. An advantage that he was able to gain, though, from very early on was control of Rome and Italy. So in between campaigns, he could be in Rome itself, where he made use of the dictatorship as early as 49. In this instance, he did so in the old-style commissary way. He was dictator just for a few days in order to hold elections for the consulships of 48, though, and you may have noticed this if you've done any of the reading, that all this was rather irregular because while he was presiding over the elections, he also stood as a candidate himself, and, surprise, he was duly elected. During 48, Caesar was nominated to a one-year dictatorship with, in effect, sovereign power, and with a very loose mandate, rather like Sulla's, rather than some specific emergency purpose. And in 48, he continued also as consul, so he was dictator and consul simultaneously. Then in 46, after a little gap, the Senate voted Caesar a 10-year dictatorship of the same type. a sovereign dictatorship, a sweeping one, also held with a consulship, a 10-year dictatorship in 46. And finally, you may know this, in February 44, the Senate made the term of his dictatorship perpetual. They upgraded the 10 years to life. And that was an upgrade that surely boosted many senators' resolve to assassinate Caesar, as they did the following month on the Ides of March 44. Certainly at this stage, because Caesar was preparing to leave Rome for what he anticipated would be a long campaign far away in the east against the Parthians or Persians, a dictatorship was useful to him. It meant that he could leave his deputy, the Magister Equitum, Marcus Lepidus, in charge in Rome, along with his fellow consul Mark Antony. But in making it clear that life tenure of the office appealed to him, Caesar abandoned Sulla's restraint in this respect. Now all hope was gone for those senators who had supported Caesar in the hope that he would in due course restore the Republic, with the Senate naturally resuming its leading role, the role which Sulla, you remember, had tried to strengthen. Caesar made it crystal clear that this was not his vision. He openly dismissed the Republic. He called it nothing. It's a nothing. It's a mere name. It no longer has any form or substance. Pfft, the Republic is over, was Caesar's view. He mocked Sulla for being so stupid as to resign from his dictatorship. And he went on to say that doing that showed that Sulla didn't have the first clue about politics. Caesar's view was he was quite open about this. What? You get the dictatorship? Whoa, the dictatorship. And then, you idiot, you go and resign it? You must be loony. That's ridiculous. You haven't a clue. Once you become dictator, stay it. But the key difference between himself and Sulla, which Caesar didn't want to face, was that Sulla at least had a vision, a plan, however flawed, and a plan, a vision and a plan, however flawed, to achieve that vision. Caesar, by contrast, had no vision and no plan. Unlike Sulla, as I've said, he was determined to hold on to the absolute power that he had fought so hard and long to gain, rather than to let it go. But by 45, it's evident that he was also aware that a long-term or even life dictatorship would not, in fact, be acceptable to many senators. So he was in a jam. But he had no more viable alternative in mind. And the Parthian campaign was partly an effort by Caesar to get away from Rome and to put on hold the burning issue of what to do about the Republic and his own place in it. He couldn't see any way forward other than more power for himself, which he knew was unacceptable to many, many senators. This effort to leave only prompted the many frustrated senators not to delay in seeking closure. They felt the need to strike while the hated perpetual dictator was still with them in Rome, and hence their action on the Ides of March, which was a couple of days before Caesar was due to leave Rome for the East. Amid the shock afterwards, one proposal made by Mark Antony as consul was that the office of dictator be formally abolished. Of course, such abolition would only be a token gesture at best, because someone might still seek to gain and maintain absolute personal control, and then the title was a mere word. Final surprise! Contrary to all expectation, such control, one person gaining sole control, was gained again after 14 more years of civil war. Yeah, 14 years more of civil war. Control gained by Caesar's grand nephew, Gaius Octavius, or who we in Shakespeare call Octavian. Now, Octavian also wanted to maintain the power that he had won, and so he too then faced the same problem of trying to find a form of regime acceptable to Romans, particularly senators, yet one in which also there was a position for himself which he found acceptable too. For Octavian to develop such a workable balance became a matter of trial and error, but after a long while he pulled through, and he achieved that. He achieved a balance, and there was one lesson that he learned from Caesar's experience that he never forgot. Steer clear of the dictatorship or the kingship or any other untraditional office. Don't take any supreme office like that or anything untraditional. Instead, Octavian drew on Sulla's example and gradually restored the Republic, as he said. Though it wasn't quite a restoration, because this now quietly incorporated a very discreet, informal role for himself in the background as a strongman umpire who had authority to discipline anybody who stepped out of line. So this was now a republic. It was the republic back, but there was an umpire strongman in the background. Octavian didn't want to abdicate as Sulla had done, and he realized that in any case such a step was likely to do more harm than good, because all that would happen is that more strife would return. Instead, Octavian studiously maintained a low profile. In the summary that he wrote of his achievements that was released after his death in 14 CE or AD, he claimed with pride, this point as I've said, that he claimed, I never accepted any special untraditional office. And in particular, even though I was offered the dictatorship more than once, I never accepted that. His great-uncle Caesar had starkly exposed the potential of the dictatorship to a quite unprecedented degree. And thereby he'd made the word dictator as loathsome to Romans as king had always been. Octavian, or from 27 BC, he took a new name then. He called himself Augustus, or the Senate gave him the name Augustus. Octavian becomes Augustus. And from then onwards, he insisted that he was merely princeps, the Latin word princeps, in a restored republic. And princeps means simply leading person. It's a very innocuous, informal term. Princeps, top guy, leading person. That's all it means. It's not pretentious, so there's nothing official about it. And this was a style of rule that turned out to last for more than 2 centuries, and it's what we call today the Principate. As I say, one of its defining characteristics, one of its most important characteristics, was to resist drawing attention to the strong authority which each princeps did in fact possess, but didn't draw attention to. Above all, the princeps did not want to be thought of as a dictator-like ruler. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Talbert, for that talk that brought up a lot of really thought-provoking questions. So let's lead off with a question here from Abby Allen. She asks, was Rome's adoption of 2 consuls influenced by another state? I'm thinking here of the system of 2 kings used by Sparta.
It's unfortunate you bring in the kingship. Ooh, let's not go there. No, I don't. Well, that parallel, I think, won't work. Maybe you know all about this, but no, probably this is the tradition for Sparta, and I think we could give it a bit of credence, is that Sparta way back is actually the merging of two communities, each of which had a head, a king, and Sparta most strangely, most peculiarly among Greeks, perhaps among states generally, I don't know. Yeah, you're right, kept on having the two kings. No, why there are two kings at Rome? Again, it's, two consuls. This is all part of the foundation of the Republic and these ideas, and where the ideas came from, who had them, we don't know. There may well have been other communities up and down the Italian peninsula. The Italian peninsula is a whole patchwork quilt of different peoples, languages, cultures, ideas. The Romans may have been shopping, they may have seen some of these. And of course, if you have two, the whole idea is that one keeps an eye on the other. And then you're going to say, well, isn't this sort of self-defeating because it discourages anything getting done? But as I've explained, Romans rather wanted that when they founded the Republic. They didn't want a state that would function much, except when it had to. And remember, both then and throughout antiquity, people expect much less of their government than we do today. So yeah, it's a fair question, and you could go around looking for parallels, and that's reasonable, but I would be very skeptical. We really don't know enough to be able to fix on one confidently.
Thank you for that. All right, we'll certainly loop back to the question of consuls in a moment here, but first we have a question from Charlie Norcus, who's curious to know about why you see Sulla as significant but have dismissed Marius. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. All right, well, this could be getting a bit off topic, but this is back to the vision thing. Sulla, for all his limitations and for all the violence that he let loose and the bad things he did, Sulla had a vision. And whether I don't hope none of us wants to do it in the way he did, but so violently, but he very strongly believed in the Republic. He thought more broadly in political, constitutional terms. And if you compare him with Marius, and the two come from very different backgrounds, if you compare him with Marius, the fact is that though Marius was a very, very effective general, and Marius, yes, indeed, give him his credit, Marius saved Rome from a great big invasion, all rather mysterious, but from northern peoples who at the end of the 2nd century, yes indeed, really did threaten Italy. And Marius did indeed, you're quite right, you haven't said it, but I've said it for you, Marius is a very, very important figure who saves Rome, but he has no political constitutional vision. And Marius really, well, this is maybe, we don't want to get too deep into this because we could be here for weeks, but Marius is part of the problem because Marius confronting the threat presented by these northern peoples Marius is something who shows up why the Romans couldn't go on running their republic as they had been, because the republic faced problems which could not be solved through the means of the traditional arrangements. And one of the problems with Marius is, you may know this, is that he's consul, well in the end at one stage he's consul for 5 years in a row. You can't be that. That's an absolute no. But the voters want him there. And that, of course, drives a coach and horses through the rules and also the customary way of doing things. But Rome is between a rock and a hard place. What are you going to do? Unless you make special arrangements, then you're going to collapse because you've got this northern onslaught on the doorstep. And you've got to combat it, but you're going to have to make special arrangements to do that. Well, then you dent the rules of your cherished republic, and that has fallout. And this is partly what Sulla's trying to put Pandora back in the box. That all this has spewed out. Sulla wants to put it back and put the lid on it because he wants to go back to normality, stability, and respect for the rules. But the Republic faces problems which can't be dealt with in the normal way. And then you may know too, others may know, after Sulla's efforts fall apart partly because of another guy in the east called Mithridates, and he has to be dealt with, and Pompey does that. But I think we could go off into let's stop there on that one.
Thank you for that. You mentioned voting a moment ago, and I want to return to that. Did consuls run for office in any way that would be recognizable to us today?
Oh, yes, very much so. Oh, yes, indeed, they did. Yes. Now, voting is a bit complicated. It's not one man, one vote. I pray we don't have to go there, but if you insist, we can. No. I mean, and also, what you've got to remember here is that the consulship, and later there are, as Rome gets bigger and more complicated, there are more magistrates of lower rank, and essentially all of them hold office for only a year. And so if you're a Roman citizen who's interested in politics and office holding and so on, you're forever voting. I mean, some people, in the US think it's bad enough that we're doing this. Well, I know it's only president once every 4 years, and there are other years, of course, when there are midterm elections and so on. Americans are voting quite often, but I don't know whether they're necessarily voting on a big scale every year, are they? But Romans are. Voting is a sort of way of life. And oh yes, I mean, they make campaign speeches, they go round the forum, not in 2020, I know, but hugging people, kissing babies, shaking hands, behind the back, I never said this, but some money may change hands. No. It's all traditionally, now this changes over time, but traditionally when you're a voter and you vote, this of course goes back to an oral society more than a writing one, you speak your vote. And be careful, therefore, that if, I wouldn't accuse any of you of this, but if you have accepted a few coins for voting a particular way, then the person who's paid you those coins can check whether you are voting the correct way. And God help you if you don't. Secret ballot does eventually come in. But no. I mean, Roman elections, if we were catapulted back to Rome at election time, it would be very familiar to us.
And were there any examples of the dictatorship itself playing a role in those behind-the-scenes dealings, where a consul functionally made a deal to grant someone that power of dictatorship after the election if they won? Or was that a concern that...
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Of course, in principle, it's conceivable. But no, as I've been saying, usually the dictatorship is so much, either it's something very routine about banging the nail in, and then you're dictator for the afternoon. That's all really. Otherwise, if it's serious, it's going to be some military emergency, which suddenly, there's an army of Gauls have come over the hill and we hadn't noticed it coming. It's so much a short-term emergency thing. And also remember, well, no, I suppose it's true. I was going to say, if you're a dictator, you're not necessarily going to gain enormous prestige from that. But no, I suppose, if you repulse the Gauls, then you will. But it's going to be a once-off. And if you're asked to repulse the Gauls, you're probably going to be somebody who's got military experience already. You're likely to be an ex-consul and so on. So you're not going to need that many. You're not going to be pushing for lots more distinctions, I would imagine. I mean, it's a fair question, and it's certainly possible, but I don't think it would have happened much.
Okay, thank you. So we have just a few more questions here. How often were ex-consuls punished after their term had ended? And did this discourage people either from accepting those appointments or from willingly leaving office?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes. How often, to what extent were lawsuits brought afterwards, and how successful were they? Well, again, we don't have a complete record, but there are, I think the short answer at the end of the day is probably that there tended not to be much in the way of successful prosecutions, I would imagine. There could be some incentive to bring them because those sorts of prosecutions were often brought by more junior senators, and even though senators did have a collegial spirit, one way of getting up the greasy pole and drawing attention to yourself as a more junior senator was to prosecute a senior one successfully. But as you can imagine, that's a very risky path to try, because if it goes wrong, then you're going to go way down the greasy pole in a hurry, not up. One thing to bear in mind is that if a prosecution is brought, it's got to be brought privately. Rome, this is a thing to bear in mind, Rome doesn't have a public prosecutor. There is no public defender or public prosecutor or anything like that. All cases must be brought at your expense, in your time, and if there is a blowback or whatever, if you're going to suffer from this, you'll have it personally. Nobody's going to be doing it neutrally on behalf of the state. The other thing I should remind you, if you have this in mind, as to try and prosecute a consul, say, who's not been successful, is that it probably won't work. The obvious way to do it would be if the guy is defeated on campaign, if he loses the battle. But then aristocratic cohesion comes to the fore. This sense of collegial identity that aristocrats have, and what they would do, some of us might say, is they then misuse Roman religion. And this works, because if you lose the battle, then what you claim, if there's an investigation or a trial, is you say, oh, yeah, it's true, I lost it, and I'm really, really, really sorry about this. But it's nothing to do with my generalship, because I now remember that at the sacrifice before we went into battle, and there has to be one, and the outcome has to be favorable, the priest in charge of slitting the throat or something didn't do it quite right and didn't report it correctly, or the number of bumps on the sheep's liver that has to be inspected. That was done wrong. And we should never have gone into battle in the first place. And so don't blame me, it wasn't my fault. The signal from the gods actually was quite clear, but it was misread. Not by me, I didn't do that. And I'm caricaturing this a bit, but we have cases where people got off. There's a famous story, you may have heard it. This is actually a naval battle where the Roman admiral is all gung-ho to go in against the Carthaginians. But in order to do this, the sacred chickens in the cage on his flagship have got to eat the sacred grain the correct way. I don't know what the details are, but they've got to go gobble, 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 gobble or something. And if they just go peck, peck, that won't do. And all these wretched chickens are doing is peck, peck. So the commander gets frustrated and he says, well, if they won't eat properly, let them drink. So he turfs them over the side. They all drown. And then he says, oh, to heck with all this, let's go into battle. Let's have the battle. And what happens? Of course, the Romans lose.
Fascinating. Thank you. All right, well, we have one last question to end on here, and it's a doozy. And it's a question that I'm sure has been on the minds of many of our listeners today, which is a comparison between what you've described and our current situation. So with the Senate having lost the ability to compromise, with our current administration threatening to delay the transfer of power, what are the parallels that you see here between first century Rome and us?
Well, whoa, now we're on delicate ground, and as you realize, it's all the more delicate because the person you've asked the question of is not a fellow American. I love America and so on, and North Carolina, don't get me wrong, all that, but as you can tell, perhaps from the accent, etc., you might have worked out by now, I am not American, and I would not for a moment presume to lecture Americans about their future or what they should or shouldn't do. But no, I see that if I understand the apprehensions that you're feeling in this particular moment, this month and next, I mean it is a worry. Yes, yeah. I think that it's one difference that I would point out, and Joanna has already referred to this in posing the question, and that is that you have, or you could argue that you have a president and a Senate who are in step. You're not likely perhaps to get that in Rome in quite the same way. First, of course, because remember, you don't anyway just have one consul. You've always got two, and so that can maybe help stop one person trying to get sole charge. And also remember that the Senate is not a government. The Senate of Republican Rome, or indeed even later under Augustus, the Senate is not a government. It's an advisory council. And the whole point is that this is where issues are debated. And also another very big difference, which is very, very important, as you'll agree, I'm sure, is that Romans don't have political parties. There are no political parties. And you may say, oh, well, how on earth can the place function? Whoa, how does that work? Well, what it means is that, of course, on individual issues which are brought to the Senate and discussed, clusters of opinion form. And there are votes in the Senate, and you can vote for and against different proposals and so on. But what you don't have, and Romans would be shocked by this, Romans would think this was demeaning to somebody's dignity and individuality, that they would make a bargain to say, I'll join such and such a group, and we'll always have a group view and vote together. And sure, I understand, that can bring strength. But Romans wouldn't want to make that sacrifice. And Romans do, of course, cluster around a particular opinion or against a proposal, and there are votes to pro and con, etc., and discussion. But you can't, in Rome, you must never think of the Senate as being a solid block. Or with a sort of solid majority or something like that. It's much more fluid. And therefore, for Rome to face exactly the same potential crisis, which some think could loom next month here, is much less likely, much less likely. But it's true that at the end of the day, I think it would be true to say that Rome very much lacks institutions. The US, on the other hand, as you know, doesn't. And perhaps of the two states, it would be fair to say that the US is better equipped. It has better, stronger institutions to be able to withstand and resist the worst happening than Rome did, perhaps.
Well, that's a beautifully optimistic note for us to wrap up on. Thank you so much for this talk today. I think you've left us all with a lot to think about and a lot of really helpful resources to bear in mind as we look towards our own election in just a few weeks. So thank you, Dr. Talbert. Thanks to our partners at Sandhills. And thanks to all of you for listening today.
Thank you.